Hi guys, it's Izzy and today I'm going to be doing a video all about disability representation in fiction. This is not specific to any age category. This is going to be middle grade, young adult and adult, so because there's not that much representation, we are going to be talking about the good, the bad and the ugly in representation. I am personally disabled. I have connective tissue disorder that is genetic. I use a wheelchair to get about. I'm relatively sick. I have a lot of conditions, so I am obviously disabled myself. I do have anxiety, but this is going to be specifically about physical disabilities, but it does include learning disorders such as autism and Asperger's, because that is counted under a disability rather than a mental health problem. So while I do have anxiety, and I do know that that's another conversation that I want to have a talk about, but today is going to be specifically for physical disabilities rather than mental health. I have searched high and low for disability representation in books. I have over 250 books that I've read and counted on Goodreads, and as far as I could count, 12 of them have disability rep in them, and that is not main characters. The majority of these are side characters. Disabled led stories, I think there are 4, so it's pretty lacking. I'm going to go into the examples of books, disability and why I think it was done poorly or well. At the end I will sort of sum up what I think is good representation in books. For all these books, I am obviously not affected by all these different disorders, so I can't speak for every disabled person, and this is obviously my own view as a disabled person. This does not speak for everyone with disability. Everyone has their own journey with their disability and feels very differently about it, but I've tried to look at for Own Voices reviews for each of these books for specific illness representation for people that have these disorders, to try and get like a general consensus as well as my own. But seeing as people don't care about disabled people, there's not very many Own Voices reviews because they are not sent out to Own Voices reviewers. They're not worried about us disabled folk, so it was quite hard to find, but I've done my best to try and find a general consensus on whether this is good or bad representation. I'm going to start off with the ugly so we can end on a bit of a high. This is probably going to be a bit depressing because there's a lot of poor representation in my opinion. So let's get started. The first book I'm going to talk about is The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime by Mark Haddon. This is about a boy called Christopher. It says on the back that Christopher has Asperger's syndrome. However, they seem to have pulled back from that a bit recently. I think since there's been quite a lot of backlash about the poor representation of Asperger's, it's not really sold as that anymore, but it does say on the blurb that it is about a boy with Asperger's. He finds a dead dog and goes on a murder investigation to see if he can find out who has killed the dog. But looking at reviews of people with Asperger's or autism, or people with family members with that, this is not done well at all. There's some really harmful stereotypes about Asperger's and autism in this book. It suggests that people with Asperger's and autism are violent, arrogant, elitist, rude, all negative traits really. All the negative stereotypes are showcased in this book. Mark claimed that he did very little research on Asperger's. He didn't know anyone with those conditions, and literally all he did was read a couple of essays. So this is not Own Voices, it's not even a researched book, and I read reviews that are saying this is just a book that will give harmful and abusive stereotypes toward autism and Asperger's, which doesn't need to be perpetrated any further than it already is. And all around, this is not a well done portrayal of learning difficulties, because it was not researched whatsoever, and it just perpetrates harmful stereotypes that are not even close to true. And Also, no able-bodied people are held accountable in this book. It is always their behaviour. His dad is extremely abusive towards him, but it's always explained away by he just struggles with Christopher's learning difficulties, which is no excuse for any sort of abusive behaviour. It is always on able-bodied people to make a decision about how they want to treat other people, and they are constantly rude and awful towards Christopher, and none of them are ever held accountable to their actions. It's just explained away that like it was Christopher's fault. So all around, this is not a good book. I don't want to take anyone's experiences away, so if in this video I say that something's not good representation but you found comfort in it, that's absolutely fine. This is just my opinion about negative stereotypes being perpetrated in books and what I think should change. The next book I'm going to talk about, which could go in the bad category, this isn't the worst one, but this is The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett, hard name to say, and this is a book about a girl called Mary who loses both her parents and lived in India and has to move back to England to stay with her uncle, I believe, or like a grandparent, and she has no one to play with. One day she discovers a secret garden, and she also discovers a boy named Colin. This book was written a long time ago, so it was just says that he was weakened by like infections, and I think he had like scoliosis. I'm not 100% sure, I don't exactly remember how it was stated, but Colin is in a wheelchair for the large majority of this. This is slightly spoilery, but I think it's worth talking about. If you really don't want to know anything about this book, you can skip, but I think this is really important. At the end of this, Colin gets out of his wheelchair and is able to walk. Now, while this can be the case for some disabled people are injured and can get better, and that's great. But bearing in mind this book is for children and will probably be one of the very few books they read about children who are disabled, I think it's really harmful that at the end Colin just kind of gets up and realises he could have walked all along, and it's just like if he tried hard enough, that's how he could walk. Like anyone in a wheelchair, if they just put their mind to it, could hop out and go on a little stroll, which while a lot of people who are disabled can walk a few steps, I can walk a few steps, but because I feel concerned that they would see another child in a wheelchair and wouldn't understand that that child is not able to do that. While this is a story that should exist, this is going to be one of the only ones children do read, and it concerns me that the only portrayal they will see is someone just out of sheer will being able to walk, which is just not the case in the real world. So I personally am not a fan of how this book ended. The next book I'm going to talk about is Everything Everything by Nicola Yoon. This made me really angry when I read it. This is a book about a girl called Maddie who has a disorder which is severe combined immunodeficiency, which means she cannot leave the house as she is basically allergic to the outside world. One day a boy comes along and moves in next door, and they start a conversation in text and emails and that kind of stuff, and they develop a relationship. Now this again is going to contain some spoilers for the book. If you really want to know anything about it, skip ahead, but I again think this needs to be discussed. All along it turns out that Maddie did not have a disease. It turned out all along her mum had some very severe mental issues after her husband and son died. Maddie's brother and Maddie's dad died, and she felt she needed to keep Maddie safe and keep her inside. And while again this is a story that can and should be told, if it is done, one, by someone who knows about this and isn't just writing about it for no reason, and two, I went into this book thinking I was finally going to see myself in a book. I am housebound quite a lot of the time. I do also have immune conditions, which mean I am allergic to a large majority of stuff, And I thought, finally, here's a book where I will see another teenager, another girl, housebound for a large majority, struggling to connect with the outside world, but still being able to develop a relationship. And I felt that I was kind of betrayed by this book, because all along it turned out she wasn't ill and then she could just go ahead and live her life normally. And again, this isn't the same as The Secret Garden. This felt like having my representation taken away from me. It was another book where I thought I might possibly be able to see myself, and again, that was not the case. So I think it was done really poorly. And also, Maddie finds out that she is not sick by chasing after the boy she develops a relationship with. Not allowed to go outside because it could kill her and would kill her if she had this immunodeficiency disorder, but she goes outside while she still believes she has that disorder, just to follow a boy. And I think it's really harmful that this girl is thinking that she would die just because of this boy. Like, she went outside knowing it could kill her, but just because she wanted a relationship with this boy. I just think it's a really dangerous thing to put into the world. I don't really think that that should be an example set to people, and it sat really uncomfortably with me, and I was not a fan of it at all. The last book I'm going to talk about, personally my least favourite book with disabled representation, is Me Before You by Jojo Moyes. Don't know how you say it, don't care. I hate this book with quite a burning passion. Now, this is gonna, all of these are going to have spoilers about the people's disability, but I really don't think that the discussion around disability should be a spoiler, because a lot of it sucks. So I think people, especially people with disability, should know going in, because I found a lot of these books really uncomfortable and I would rather not have read them had I known what the content was going to be. But Me Before You is about a girl called Louisa who goes and becomes a carer for this man Will, who is a quadriplegic. He was paralysed in an accident and he cannot move his arms or his legs or like anything below the neck, which has made his life very difficult because he was used to going out and enjoying life, and he was very adventurous and took a lot of risks and was generally a very outgoing person. But he decides that he wants to end his life due to his disability, and he would like to have assisted suicide. I do know that stories like this do exist, and again, this is a book I think should be out there, but my main problem is this is going to be the only book able-bodied people read with disabled people in it, especially someone in a wheelchair and someone who cannot move part of his limbs and needs a lot of personal care. And they are going to see this and think that being like this, being disabled, is worse than death. Now, some disabled people do feel like that, and I empathise with them, and I'm glad they may have a book that shows their story, but this was written by an able-bodied person. And also, I just think that this being the only book able-bodied people will read, not being by a disabled author, and it being about a man who decides to commit suicide due to being disabled, I think is extremely harmful. It makes me really uncomfortable, because every single able-bodied person is going to read this book and are going to think that every single disabled person feels suicidal because of their disability. And everyone loved this book and everyone cried about this book and everyone thought this book was a work of genius. And when I was like 14, I read this and I was like, wow, this is such a sad book. I was disabled then, but I didn't realise the implications of this book. And now that I'm 20 and I am much older and I've had a lot more experience with disability and disability representation, it really does not sit well with me that this is going to be the book that people can say, oh, I've read a book with a disabled main character, but it's a book where the main character kills himself. So, not personally what I think should, and if this story is to be written, it should be written by a disabled person. It's not for an able-bodied person to write, because you could never understand that kind of mindset without having, you just can't. that's not something that able-bodied people should write. So it's my least favourite book, one of my least favourite books of all time, and I'm sad that it got made into a movie as well, because it was mainly just a nice cry for everyone, and that was it, and that really sits uncomfortably with me. But finally we're over with the ugly section, so that was fun. Love that for us. Disabled representation is so good. No. We're going to move on to the bad, which I don't think is harmful, but I just don't think is good. So the ugly I think is actually harmful representation and will damage the way people see disabled people, but the bad is just not done well, in my opinion. The first book in the bad category I'm going to talk about is Magnus Chase and the Sword of Summer by Rick Riordan. The whole trilogy includes a disabled person. This book contains a deaf person. Well, he's not a person, is he an elf or a dwarf? One of the two. He's deaf anyway. And while I'm really pleased that this character was included, I don't think the representation was done well, in that the character's name is Hearth, and while he uses sign language, no one around him uses sign language, but he uses lip reading to see what other people are saying, and he keeps up perfectly. I do have some hearing loss and I do rely on lip reading quite often, but he is able to lip read in high action scenes. He is able to lip read when he cannot, it is unlikely he could directly see the person's mouth. He can lip read in pretty much every scenario, which is not realistic at all. You have to be looking directly at a person usually to be able to keep up perfectly with lip reading, and it is unrealistic that no one around him uses sign language, because it would be very hard for him to communicate if no one around him knows sign language and he has to rely totally on lip reading. So yeah, this wasn't like harmful and I'm not like angry. I just think it could have been done better. Maybe the able-bodied people learning sign language and learning to communicate with Hearth because they're his friend and they want to be able to communicate with him more, or just showing that lip reading is pretty hard to keep up with. It takes a lot of concentration and you have to be pretty aware to be able to lip read perfectly, and just seeing him like get a lot of sentences wrong would be more realistic than him keeping up perfectly. I'm glad Rick Riordan included a deaf character, that's great, I'm pleased about that, but I think a little bit more research could have been done to make this a better character. The next book I'm going to talk about is Gemina by Amy Kaufman and Jay Kristoff. This is the second book in the Illuminae files. This is not actually going to explain what all of these books are about, but just tell you like what it specifically pertains to in terms of representation. In this book, so far, Me Before You, Will was a main character. In The Secret Garden, Colin was a main character, and in The Curious Incident of Dog in the Nighttime, Christopher was the protagonist, the person who was narrating the story. In Magnus Chase, Hearth was just a side character, and in Gemina, Ella, the disabled person, is also just a side character. Now, Ella uses a wheelchair. She is said to have had a lot of damage done by an infection, so she cannot walk and she needs like help with breathing and that kind of stuff, which I was really happy to see. And again, I don't think this is harmful. I just see so much room for improvement, and I just like to point out where things are not done well and where they could improve. So Ella is the two like main people in it are Hannah and Nick, and Ella is Nick's cousin, but they're sort of like a brother-sister relationship. Now, this was almost well done. It was so close to being well done, but I think they went too hard with the she's just like everyone else. Now, every disabled person is independent. They're their own person with their own autonomy, and they are equally useful and worthy and all that kind of stuff. That's what I want to see in books, just an equal person who happens to be disabled. But I think they went too hard with the independence thing, because they're like, Ella's just like everyone else. Ella's even more helpful. She can do all this hacking. She's so useful. But they don't really show the actual problems with being disabled. Like, she's just able to do everything so easily, and like nothing stops her, which is great, but also not realistic. That's just, you do get into situations that are hard to handle because you're in a wheelchair, you can't fit, maybe your breathing equipment gets broken, or it gets trapped, or maybe you can't type things as quickly as normal people. There's just so many things that can be an issue, not that ruin your life, but there's just a lot of things that come with being in a wheelchair. And she was always doing things despite her disability, which doesn't sit that comfortably with me. I don't think you ever do anything despite your disability, you just do things with your disability. It's just something you have to carry. It's just something that's part of you that you have to learn how to manoeuvre. But all the reviews I read were like, oh, Ella is such a great character despite her disability. Oh, Ella could do things despite her disability. Oh, Ella was a hero despite her disability. It's not despite her disability, it's with her disability. It doesn't have to be, look what you've overcome. It's just, look what you've done. Oh, and you also did it in a wheelchair. It's not, Hannah and Nick were never doing anything despite something. They were just doing it. And Ella was just doing it too, in a wheelchair. So that didn't sit with me great. And also, spoilers for the end of the third book. But there are 3 couples. In the end scene, there are 3 couples. Katie and Ezra, Hannah and Nick. I don't remember the other 2's name from Obsidio, but they are all in a relationship. So there are 7 characters, 6 of them are in a relationship. But oh, look who's not in a relationship. It's the disabled one, isn't it? Didn't see that one coming. Why can disabled people not have a love interest? Someone tell me why. Why could she not have had a love interest? Everyone else got one, but no, Ella's just on her own in a wheelchair. Wouldn't want anyone to fancy her, crikey. Whew. Going too crazy. Someone liking a disabled person. Whew. That's wild. It's just stupid. She could have had a romantic interest, and she was the only one at the end who didn't, and that stood out to me, and that's what I noticed on the end of the book, was everyone got their happily ever after with the person they love, but Ella's still on her own. Not that there's anything wrong with being single, it's just that no one else was single, just the disabled person. So those couple of things could have been changed and it would have been done really well. Again, it wasn't particularly harmful, just not the best. The final book I'm going to talk about in the bad category is The Fault in Our Stars by John Green. This book, Hazel and Gus have cancer. Hazel has lung cancer and Gus has, can't think of the name, I'll put it here. And they are both pretty sick with their cancer. They are both living with terminal cancer, and like Hazel needs a breathing machine towards the end, Gus needs a wheelchair. They just don't actually represent how sick people live. I understand John Green did genuinely do his research, and I'm glad, and this definitely isn't a terrible representation by any means, but sick people can't do a lot of the stuff that Hazel and Gus did. They just can't. A lot, especially with cancer, you are genuinely too poorly to do things, and such as like going to the Anne Frank house and climbing all those floors. I really don't think 2 people who are so sick could do that. And overall, there's nothing like particular. It just didn't go into enough detail about what a sick person's life is like day to day. It didn't show the pain. I just don't think it showed enough of like the medications and the procedures and the treatment that comes with having cancer. And yeah, it was okay, just wasn't great. So that's the last one in my bad category. Woo, we're moving on up. The next book I'm going to talk about in the good category. We've made it, guys, we're here. There's 4 books. 4 books with good disability representation out of 250. You can see why we have a bit of an issue here. I bet you no other minority has so few books. The first book in the good category I'm going to talk about is Wonder by R.J. Palacio. Now, this is a book that has a few different viewpoints. in the disabled community. Some people weren't as big a fan of it, but this is personally my opinion and quite a lot of other people's opinion. But I think Oggy has a facial disfigurement. It's never completely described because that's not how Oggy sees himself. He doesn't see himself as having wonky, he just sees his face and that's him. And this book really just, he was quite disabled when he was younger. He had to have a lot of surgeries, but he is now going into middle school, I believe. I don't know, it's American. And he is fully able except for his facial disfigurement, and he needs hearing aids. But I think this is a really nice book, especially for children. This is a middle grade, and all in all it just encourages kindness, and I think that's really important for children to learn, that yeah, he's got a facial disfigurement, he's still a kid just like you or me, and he still deserves the same respect and the same friendship and the same kindness as you would give to someone who didn't have a facial disfigurement. And it showed Oggy could still conquer a lot. Even though he had this facial disfigurement, it wasn't going to stop him from doing anything, which is what I want to see. Like, Oggy didn't do things despite his disability, he just did things with a facial disfigurement. That was it, and that's how Oggy saw himself, and that's how his family saw him. He was just Oggy, and he was just living his life, but happened to have a facial disfigurement. And I really liked this book. He did get an award at the end of the year for braveness and courage, which some people thought, oh, you're like living with a disability, you weren't being brave or courageous. But I think Oggy did a lot of stuff that wasn't really related to his disability, that showed that he was really kind and a nice human being, and I think he deserved an award for that anyway. It just happened that he did have a facial disfigurement, which did make things harder for him to make friends and stuff, but he never gave up, he never changed, he never was mean to anyone despite them being mean to him. He was just genuinely a really nice kid, and I think that deserves an award anyway. But he just did it with a lot more adversity facing him. He still managed to be kind, and I think that's what's really important about this book. The next book I'm going to talk about is A Gentleman's Guide to Vice and Virtue by Mackenzie Lee. This has a boy with epilepsy in it. He is the love interest, so he is not the main character, he's not the protagonist, but he is a main character. I liked this book because it showed Percy as a complex and nuanced character who had a lot to offer as a character, and he wasn't just the disabled one. He wasn't just a character who was disabled. That wasn't his defining factor, and that's what I really liked about his character and really liked about the way this was written, because Percy was Percy. He had epilepsy, he was gay, he was black, he was clever, he was witty, he was just everything, and everything came together to make him Percy. And that's what I think was really well done. He stood up for himself all the time, he made strong points without ever being mean, he stood up for himself, he just said it like it was. He didn't let the ignorance slip by, but he also wasn't, I don't know, there to teach them. He just didn't let stupid things be said, and he was just a really great all-round character, and that's what I want from disabled representation, is just good characters who have a disability as well. That's it. The next book I'm going to talk about is 5 Feet Apart by Rachel Lippincott. This is what I wanted from The Fault in Our Stars, and I'm really glad this book exists. Both the main character and the love interest have cystic fibrosis, along with the main character's best friend. This just... the sentence I wrote is actually shows how sick people live. Yay. And that basically describes how I feel. This shows what it's like to live in hospital, to go through a lot of treatments, a lot of surgeries, to how you interact with your friends when you're sick and when you're away from them for quite a long period of time, how you are still funny and witty and clever and have conversations and make friends, and you're still a fully formed person but you are sick as well, and it did not shy away from showing all the treatments they had to go through as sick kids. They had Hickman lines, and they had their PT vests, and they had IVs, and they had surgeries, and they had all the kind of stuff that comes along with being sick. And I thought it was done really well. Again, with the movie, they for once actually showed like medical equipment and having Hickman lines and peg tubes and all kinds of stuff that you have when you're sick. And I was just so glad to actually see it, because that's what I wanted from The Fault in Our Stars, but pretty much all we got was like a nasal oxygen tube, and that was about as much medical stuff as we were getting into. And while I don't think it needs to be like, oh, look at all this medical stuff we have to do, it should just be included in their day-to-day life, because that's what their day-to-day life involves, and I think it was done really well. The last book I'm going to talk about in the good category is Lair of Dreams by Libba Bray. I mean, we all know I love this series, but this book, in the second book and the third book, has a character called Ling, who is on crutches and has leg braces. She, I believe, had polio, which left her unable to move her legs, and she can't walk properly. She, again, is just a well-rounded, nuanced, complex character who has a disability, but that's not all there is to her. She has other things to her. She also has things that make her Ling that aren't just the fact that she's on crutches and sometimes needs a wheelchair. What I liked about this is she does occasionally ask for help. Like one scene in the third book, they're in a mental institution and they have to walk a long way. She cannot do that, so she uses a wheelchair and someone pushes her, and that's like the truth. Like they could have just written it as she just hopped away on her crutches for ages, but that's not realistic. You can't use your crutches for that far. So I liked that while she was a strong character, it wasn't like, oh, look at, she can do absolutely everything an able-bodied person can do, because that's not the case. She did need help, and that's okay to ask for help. And that's what I really liked about the representation in this book. She was a great character. She had a disability. That was it. And Ling is not the protagonist, but there isn't a protagonist in The Diviners. It's a group of people, so she's one of the main characters, so yeah. And my bonus mention is going to be Six of Crows by Leigh Bardugo. One of the main characters, Kaz, uses a cane due to an injury when he was younger. The reason I didn't really talk about it is because I didn't really have anything to say. He used a cane. It was relatively well done, but I didn't really feel like there was much to say in terms of disability rep. It was just cool that he had a cane. So, and finally we have reached the end of the video. Thank you for sticking around. I'm just going to do a quick wrap up of what I think should be disabled representation, and then I'll leave you in peace. But I think disabled representation should be done in a way that acknowledges a disability. I don't think that there should be characters that act like their disability doesn't affect their life, because for a lot of people disability is a large part of their life, because it takes up a lot of time with medical procedures and all that kind of stuff, but also it's just a big part of your identity. If it's all in all, it's just not something that you don't think about. We don't go every day thinking about a cure, but we do go around every day thinking, can I get off that pavement in a wheelchair? There are things that you have to think about as a disabled person, and a book shouldn't be written so that the disability isn't mentioned at all, or that the difficulties of a disability aren't mentioned at all. It shouldn't seem doom and gloom like old Me Before You, but it is there and it should be acknowledged, and I don't think it should be like completely pushed to the side and be like, oh, they have a disability, but they're perfectly independent and fine. A lot of the time we do go day to day not thinking that, you know, about the fact that we're disabled, but there are things that just happen in life due to being disabled that you do have to think about. So I don't like it to be brushed aside completely. On the flip side, I also don't think it should be the whole character. It shouldn't be name a feature of this character. It should be they're funny, they're witty, they're serious, they're annoying, they're boring. It shouldn't be they're in a wheelchair. That shouldn't be the development of the character. It shouldn't be their disability. That shouldn't be their only defining factor. They're a person, and maybe like 5th down the list they're disabled. But it's not, that's not a character. And I think too often characters are their disability and that's it. And I just think there is a balance, which is why more own voices stories need to be written by disabled people, because there's no one better to write stories about disabled people than disabled people. But they're just not out there, and they're really hard to find. And I think diversity is moving forwards, but I think the disabled community is being left behind. This year I've read 66 books. None of them have had a disabled character in it, except for 5 Feet Apart. 1 book out of 66 books. I have read books about queer people, about black people, about every community except my own, and that feels difficult because those stories are not being told. And I love to read, I love to watch shows, I love to watch movies, I love taking in stories, but when you never ever see yourself, it gets quite disheartening, because you read all these stories about all these people saving the day or finding their true love or finding out they're magical, and they're never disabled as well. So I think the world can do better, and I really hope I can make a video next year talking about my favourite books that have disabled people in them, because someone might actually publish one day. We can hope. But seriously, 12 books on my read page is disgraceful. Like, it's disgusting. And these aren't even ones with main characters. What, 5 of them had main characters? That are disabled? That's not good enough, and I think it needs to change, especially in middle grade and young adult. Children need to see disability as normal. Teenagers need to see disability as normal. They need to see that a person can be just like them, but also use crutches, or also like need a stoma, or also need a wheelchair, or also need to have a lot of medication. It just needs to be there, and it needs to be made normal. There is a lot of conversations around mental health at the moment, which is great. I obviously suffer with mental health conditions as well, but I see myself a lot more in mental health rep than I see myself in terms of disabled representation. It's just not out there, and I think we need to start having a conversation about that too. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I've wanted to make it for some time. It's always been something I've wanted to talk about because I've been reading my whole entire life, and I've very rarely seen a character even close to me. So yeah, if you know any good disabled books with disabled characters, let me know in the comments down below. If you liked this video, subscribe. If you want to join for some more bookish content, thank you very much for sticking around for this video, and I will see you next time. Bye!